Mueller is corrupt. The senior FBI is corrupt. The system is corrupt.
I think there is, and has been ever since Trump was elected, a silent coup to get him out of office.
Illegitimate and corrupt. The deep state of Robert Mueller's partisan, extremely biased, hyper-partisan attack team.
Hatchet men that he's hired, Obama, Clinton supporters, have brought not a single case related to collusion.
Utter disgrace.
The deep state.
And the FBI has become America's secret police.
Do you see what can happen with the repetition when viewers and listeners are hearing it hour after hour? The campaign is continuing this weekend. Here's Jeanine Pirro's show from last night. And I want you to keep in mind as you watch this, Pirro counts herself as a friend and an informal advisor to the president.
There is a cleansing needed in our FBI and Department of Justice. It needs to be cleansed of individuals who should not just be fired, but who need to be taken out in handcuffs. The stench coming out of the Justice Department and the FBI is like that of a third world country. Well, it's time to take them out in cuffs.
We know the president watches and listens to these shows. So what's the impact of this anti-Mueller campaign? Back with me now, CNN political analyst Carl Bernstein. Carl, you say this is abetting a cover-up?
Yes, it abets a cover-up because there is a cover-up going on in the White House and among Trump's aides and former aides relating to these investigations. We do not know specifically what the cover-up is about, whether it constitutes an obstruction of justice or a criminal conspiracy at this point, though there's some evidence that suggests it might be the case. But yes, because the commentators that you are hearing and showing there are not open in any way to the best obtainable version of the truth, to facts, to context, who seem to be oblivious to the serial lying of the President of the United States and members of his family and those on his staff and those in the Trump organization. Yes, they are abetting a cover-up. But more important, where we need to go again is the idea of making the conduct of the press the issue, the conduct of the prosecutors the issue, making the conduct of everyone the issue except the President of the United States and those around him, including those who have pleaded guilty already.
I've seen different opinions about the real purpose of this anti-Mueller rhetoric. You see some people saying this is about goading Trump to fire Mueller. Others, like Byron York, writing this is actually impeachment politics, that there's an assumption Mueller will find something very damaging, that impeachment proceedings will begin, and attacking Mueller is a way to give Republicans a defense in an impeachment proceeding. How do you see it? Is it an attempt here to goad Trump into firing Mueller?
I think that's a little overcomplicated. I think that there is an attempt to defend Donald Trump by his base and by many, many Republicans on Capitol Hill and also ordinary Republican voters to defend him at any cost, including the cost of the truth. Because unlike Watergate, let's go back to Watergate and look at who the heroes of Watergate were. They were Republicans who said, we have a criminal president of the United States. The fact that he is a Republican does not excuse him of criminality, and he needs to leave office. We don't seem to have that same attitude among mainstream Republicans as well as Republicans of the Congress of the United States today about the fairness of an open inquiry into Donald Trump and what might have occurred in his campaign related to the undermining of an American election apparently by the Russians, according to our intelligence agencies. So we are in a situation today in which, again, everyone's conduct except those under investigation is suspect. It doesn't make sense. It's not logical. But we also are not living in a logical time. I mentioned this cold civil war a few moments ago in the earlier segment. And I think we need to look at so much of our culture in terms of the cold civil war and the willing participation of combatants, incidentally, on all sides of the cold civil war and willingness to be oblivious to facts is undermining our very culture and system. And these attacks are the most prominent evidence of how we are undermining truth and indeed abetting a cover-up by not being willing to look at what is staring us in the face, and that is, first of all, the lies of the President of the United States. Why is he lying? These same commentators at Fox ought to be, and elsewhere, ought to be asking. It doesn't mean that necessarily he ought to be impeached, that there's impeachable evidence. That's what the Mueller investigation is about, to find out, is there a real conspiracy? What is the conspiracy, if it exists, et cetera, et cetera. But it is a legitimate inquiry being conducted legitimately, and the fact that Mueller has isolated a couple of people in his investigation who seem to have expressed some political beliefs that are anti-Trump is more evidence of Mueller's attempt to conduct a fair and impartial and factual investigation, rather than the contrary.
Carl, thanks so much for being here. And up next, a dispute between Russia and the U.S. that you probably have not heard about. Senator Ben Carson says Russia is trying to... A week ago, it was Brian Ross and ABC. Ross was suspended for a breaking news report about Michael Flynn that had not been fully vetted by the network ahead of time. And since then, several more mistakes by other media outlets have caused a lot of introspection in newsrooms. On Friday, CNN gave lots of airtime to an exclusive report that said then-candidate Donald Trump and Donald Trump Jr. had received an email in September 2016, an email providing a decryption key and a web address, allowing them to access hacked DNC documents before they were publicly available. Now, later that afternoon, the story unraveled. CNN's Manu Raju went on Brooke Baldwin's show to issue this correction.
We have just obtained a copy of this email, and instead, we now learn that this email was on September 14th. So that is 10 days later than what we originally reported earlier today, and this appears to change the understanding of this story.
It changed the understanding quite a bit. With ABC's suspension of Ross still in the headlines, I asked CNN if there would be disciplinary action against Raju or his co-writer, Jeremy Herb. A spokeswoman said no, because the reporters followed CNN's standards process, which means that the anonymous sources they were using for the story were vetted and okayed ahead of time. Now, the sources had been reliable in the past, but they were not this time. The spokeswoman said CNN had no reason to believe this was malicious, meaning the sources weren't trying to trick the reporters. The sources were just mistaken. But that mistake obviously caused a black eye for CNN. On Friday night, President Trump seized on the recent corrections at a rally in Florida.
And by the way, did you see all the corrections the media's been making? They've been apologizing left and right. They took this fraudster from ABC. They suspended him for a month. They should have fired him for what he wrote. And then CNN apologized just a little while ago. They apologized. Oh, thank you, CNN. Thank you so much. You should have been apologizing for the last 2 years.
Technically, CNN did not apologize, but did correct the reporting. CBS also issued a correction for the same story. And this was not the only error of the week. Did you hear about Robert Mueller's team subpoenaing Trump's bank records from Deutsche Bank? Bloomberg and Reuters had to issue corrections, saying the documents that were subpoenaed pertain to people or entities affiliated with Trump, not the president individually. Now, that is still a big development, but it's not what the news outlets originally said. The Wall Street Journal got it right in the text of their story, but misconstrued it in the headline, so they had to run a correction as well. These errors have piled up this week. There's a new one this weekend involving the Washington Post we'll get into. So let's talk about it with Carl Bernstein, who, of course, shared the Pulitzer Prize for coverage of Watergate. He's now a CNN political analyst. And David Frum, a senior editor at The Atlantic. Carl, how damaging are these string of errors?
Well, they're damaging in the sense that this is taking place in a cold civil war in this country, in which neither side seems to have much interest in the best obtainable version of the truth. Too many people in our citizenry and in our institutions are looking for information that reinforces what they already believe, that buttresses their already held political prejudices, cultural beliefs, etc., etc. At the same time, look, reporters, journalists make mistakes. Our record as journalists in covering this Trump story and the Russian story is pretty good, especially compared to the record of Donald Trump and his serial lying. There's no other repertorial, historical word that describes it.
But hold on, Carl, you're saying our record is pretty good. But why would a Trump supporter believe that, given this repetitive string of errors?
Because I don't think a Trump supporter would believe it. And I think there is a suspension of belief and reasonable looking at how the media does its job on both sides. People are looking for information that reinforces what they already believe instead of the best obtainable version of the truth. We have to get back to the notion that, which is absolutely correct, that most of the media really tries, the mainstream media, the big news institutions, from the Washington Post to the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal to CNN, really go out of their way to be accurate, factual, contextual. And we do, and we've done a pretty good job of it. I would say, by and large, an excellent job of it in terms of the facts of this hugely complicated story. But, you know, we made a huge mistake in Watergate, Bob Woodward and I. And in today, in which we said that the principal assistant to the President of the United States had been implicated in grand jury testimony. In fact, he had not been implicated in grand jury testimony. Today, I wonder if we would have been fired for that mistake instead of continuing on the story. We are in a hothouse, cold Civil War atmosphere, and the press and attacking the press is the basic element that too many demagogues in our culture have used to whip up this cold Civil War, and especially to appeal to the base of the President of the United States.
David, what's your advice for journalists in this situation and for readers?
I have more advice for readers. You asked the question, Brian, why should, given these mistakes, why should people trust the media? And I would say the mistakes are precisely the reason that people should trust the media. Look, astronomers make mistakes all the time because science is a process of discovery of truth. Astrologers never make mistakes, or at least they never own up to them, because what they're offering is a closed system of ideology and propaganda. Faced with wrongdoing circled by lies, the process of piercing the lies to uncover the truth about the wrongdoing is inherently not only difficult but adversarial, because the people who are trying to find the truth are operating against bad faith actors engaged in concealment. So they get partial pieces of the truth. In the process, there are going to be overshoots and undershoots. That Bloomberg Reuters story you mentioned about Deutsche Bank.
Right.
Donald Trump holds most of his debt through Trump-related entities, not personally. So we don't know exactly what Deutsche Bank was subpoenaed to release, but it is not exactly wrong to say that when you get a Trump-related entity, you're getting something about Trump. Nonetheless, error of emphasis. But it's the process of bringing truth to light. Meanwhile, from the president and his supporters, you hear a system of lies. So they're not well placed to complain because the mistakes occur in the process of exposing the lies, that the liars then complain about the mistakes that are investigating them.
You're saying that journalists are held to a high standard appropriately, but that the president and his allies are having a low standard.
I'm saying something a little bit different. I'm saying, look, journalism is a process. The way you discover the truth as a consumer of news is not by reading any one story and thinking, aha, here's the truth. You have to be engaged in it. You have to be an active consumer, because this is unlike law enforcement, which investigates and produces conclusions at the end. Journalists show their work as they go. They approximate the truth. They reach it. And in this case, they are reaching it not just because the truth is inherently difficult, but because they are confronting bad faith actors engaged actively in concealment in order to deprive the public of important knowledge of wrongdoing, financial, and national security.
Mike Allen wrote about this in his newsletter for Axios this morning. Let me put this on screen real quick, Carl. I thought this stood out to me from Mike Allen this morning. He said it's the media's best and worst of times. He said Trump's anti-media argument is not broadly true. Most reporters do work hard to be fair and accurate, and national outlets have risen to this historic era with unprecedented resources and consequential journalism. And yet, Carl, this takes us back to the point from a couple minutes ago about whether the public actually believes that.
Mike Allen is right about the general excellence of the media's coverage, particularly of Donald Trump, his presidency, and this story. I think it's very important if open-minded people, and that's what we seem to be lacking on both sides, but especially Trump supporters here, and let's say that is the fact, especially among Trump supporters, about open-mindedness. The media, generally speaking, the mainstream media, makes far fewer errors than most institutions in our culture, because we indeed are in the business of trying not to make errors. And we have all kinds of procedures in place to keep us from making those errors. Compare us to Wall Street, compare us to banking, compare us to the Congress of the United States, compare us to almost any institution, and we make fewer errors. At the same time, we can't be complacent. We need to be introspective. And part of being introspective right now in this cold civil war is to look at where we are in this country in terms of the press being a crucial element of the cold civil war, and see if there are some ways that we, through more transparency, as well as perhaps change in tone in some instances, can make ourselves less the issue, the conduct of the press the issue, instead of the conduct of the president and those around him.
With the greatest respect to Carl and his incredible accomplishments, I really think framing this as a matter of two sides is fundamentally misleading. The press, the worst mistakes that, again, when we talk about the press, we exclude Fox. I mean, we talk about press organizations that have an interest in finding truth. Excluding Fox, the worst mistakes that press organizations have made in the coverage of Trump has precisely occurred in their overzealous effort to be fair to the president. Because the problem they cover is accurate coverage of this president and his campaign is very different from neutral coverage of this president and his campaign. I mean, how do you fairly report the fact that the president lies all the time and that he recruits people to work for him who lie all the time? The worst mistakes, in my opinion,
I'm not talking about neutrality, David. I'm not talking about neutrality. You're absolutely right.
The worst mistakes that press organizations have made, include CNN made. I mean, Raju and his co-author, the mistake they made, it was important. They promptly corrected it. The worst mistakes CNN has made have been the result of the determination to bring in-house Trump associates in order to promote Trump falsehoods, not from Trump HQ or not from the White House, but with CNN's own brand on them. And
we'll have to disagree on that one. I think we need to hear from Trump supporters, but
you need to hear them, but you need to hear from them as Trump supporters. You don't need to put your own brand on them, and that has been the worst mistake. But that comes from the desire to be unduly fair.
David Frum, Carl Bernstein, thank you very much.
Carl, let me add one thing before we go. The best obtainable version of the truth is not necessarily about neutrality. It is about sorting through information and presenting what the facts and context are. And that is what the major news organizations have done on this story and have done very well.
Carl, come back with me after the break. David, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And one more note about this. Dave Weigel of the Washington Post, the latest target of President Trump. On Friday night, Weigel tweeted out a picture of the Pensacola rally. It showed lots of empty seats before the rally began. Then he deleted it when he realized it was misleading. On Saturday night, we can show you here, President Trump took aim at Weigel, criticized Weigel, even after an apology was made on Twitter. I think it's notable there, at the end of the tweet, the president said, Weigel should be fired. Now, the Washington Post is not going to fire Weigel. They're standing by him. I checked in with Washington Post PR this morning. They acknowledged that Weigel made a mistake and quickly deleted it and apologized. But ask yourself, do you think it's appropriate for the President of the United States to call on individual journalists to be fired? After the break here, we're talking about Robert Mueller, his special counsel probe, and how right-wing hosts are trying to discredit Mueller. I'm Brian Stelter, and this is Reliable Sources, our weekly look at the story behind the story, of how the media really works and how the news gets made. Ahead today, this network, CNN, under scrutiny for a faulty report about Donald Trump Jr. and WikiLeaks. What went wrong, and why were there so many mistakes made by news outlets just this week? And as the Russia drip, drip, drip of real information continues to come out, so do the right-wing media attacks on Bob Mueller's credibility. What's the end game here? And later, David Axelrod, here to talk about the president's TV habits and the rise of political podcasts. You know, Tuesday's election in the state of Alabama is going to receive wall-to-wall national attention. So we start there with the polls that show a toss-up between Republican Roy Moore and Democrat Doug Jones. Moore has been avoiding interviews ever since women began to accuse him of sexual misconduct. But he's really also been running against the media, only speaking with friendly outlets, avoiding journalists who would like to talk with him, also refusing to debate his opponent. So take a look here what Moore spokeswoman Janet Porter said in 2 separate interviews with CNN this week.
I don't believe her at all, and I'll tell you why. Not only was she sought after by the Washington Post, her own mother doesn't believe elements of her story. One of the jobs of journalists is to not just take an Academy Award performance at face value. You need to dig into the facts. There's a reason why the people have the phrase fake news, because you're not investigating the false accusations, the credibility problems that are screaming. When you have false allegations that are generated by the Washington Post, there tends to be a pile-on. That's how a lynch mob works.
A media lynch mob, she says, even though the accounts from the accusers are credible. Look, it seems like Moore's campaign is taking a page straight out of President Trump's anti-media playbook. And the president has been promoting Moore on Twitter and at a Friday night rally.
This guy's screaming, we want Roy Moore. He's right. And we want jobs, jobs, jobs. So get out and vote for Roy Moore.
Most recently, a robocall recorded by President Trump is rolling out to Alabama voters. So let's talk about what the next 48 hours of campaigning has in store and what could happen on Tuesday night. Kyle Whitmire's here. He's a state political columnist for the Alabama Media Group. Also, Dale Jackson, the host of the Dale Jackson Show on WVNN Radio in Alabama. And Elena Plott, staff writer for the Washingtonian. She's a native Alabamian who's been covering the election for the magazine. Kyle, lots to talk about here. Let's start with Roy Moore and his campaigning, or lack thereof. Is it true that he's mostly missing from the campaign trail in these key final days?
Even before these allegations came out, he was pretty scarce on the campaign trail. Roy Moore has always been a candidate who sort of lets his opponents do a lot of the heavy lifting for him. He has a very, very loyal base in this state, and when his opponents attack him, when the media questions him, that only just reinforces their support for Roy Moore. And so, yeah, he's been scarce. He's even before these allegations. He's certainly been scarce since these allegations came out, and has not been making himself available to much media except for talk shows and other forums that are sympathetic or friendly to him.
Dale, you have a conservative radio host in Huntsville. Have you been able to get the candidate on your show?
Roy Moore has not come on my radio show in months, and I don't expect him to get him on the show before this election takes place or afterwards. I've been very unfriendly to Roy Moore for years here. And the real question about this is why the people don't believe what the media is saying. And the reason is simple. Lots of retractions. Donald Trump, a pathological liar, has weaponized the term fake news. And your guy sitting right there, Kyle Whitmire, years ago, wrote a piece asking if Roy Moore was gay. Why in the world would anybody listen to the stuff that's coming out of those outlets? That's the real problem here.
Kyle?
Look, these allegations are, they're credible. And yes, Dale's right about the piece I wrote years ago. The question was whether this was following a narrative that we've seen over and over and over again with his vitriol toward the LGBTQ community. But let's face it. This is an apparatus, a reality distortion field that the Republican Party and the right has created, and it's been in effect here in Alabama, that gives people license to disbelieve things that they don't want to be true.
So I wonder, Ileana, as we think about the broader context here, if this is a preview of what the midterms are going to be like, if Republican candidates are going to run against the press especially if it works for Roy Moore on Tuesday?
Well, I can tell you that I know you cited a poll that is a toss-up between Moore and Jones, but I do believe, as I have from the beginning of this election, that Roy Moore will win on Tuesday. And I think what that's going to show to every single Republican candidate going forward, especially Chris McDaniel in Mississippi against Roger Wicker, that the media is a credible opponent, that elections for Republicans do not have to be about ideology any longer, squaring up against an opponent based on policy proposals. You can weaponize fake news, as this president has done so well, and rally the base around that and feel comfortable going into a Tuesday election.
Doesn't that mean something's broken in our society?
Well, I would say so, but I also think it points to, I kind of think we forget that it wasn't until President Donald Trump that the term fake news coursed through society so easily. I mean, you can walk down the street and hear anyone use the term fake news, whether jokingly, ironically, or not. But I do think that's a signal that this is a pretty embedded part of our culture at this point, and reporters are going to have to consistently come up with ways to make sure that, they're being respected and listened to in spite of that.
Dale, I would say that sometimes you're on the radio tearing down the press, discouraging people from trusting real reporting. I think you might say that we deserve it, right?
Well, the simple fact is this. There has been an agenda against Roy Moore in the state of Alabama going back a decade. Why in the world would people believe the things that are said if it's always negative over and over and over and over again? That weaponizes the term fake news. You guys have to look inside your own house to make that conversation, because the bottom line is this. People don't trust you guys, and the reason they don't trust you is because you are constantly telling them they are wrong, they are stupid, they are racist. And then we're saying, hey, listen to us, you wrong, stupid, and racist people. It's not going to work. They don't trust you guys.
When you say they don't trust you guys, I think what you mean, Dale, is there's a percentage of the country, primarily conservatives, who for years and decades have distrusted the press, who do not trust mainstream reporting. It is not a majority of the country.
I would say it's a pretty big number. Donald Trump was able to become president of the United States using this same attack. You pointed out a minute ago, Roy Moore is doing the exact same thing. This election is about Roy Moore and Roy Moore only. None of us sitting on this panel know what Doug Jones believes on absolutely anything, because it has become a battle between Roy Moore and you guys, and he's going to win.
I do think it's a problem that Doug Jones has not received more coverage. I just saw a tweet, Kyle, from a viewer who said, the media hasn't really covered the election, they've only covered Moore. Quote, you'd barely know Jones was also running. Has that been a problem, Kyle, for you on the ground there?
I don't believe that's fair. I mean, look, yes, we don't cover houses that aren't on fire, right? Doug Jones is a pretty vanilla Democrat. That's sort of what he's put himself out there as, a generic Democrat, for the purpose of not trying to get nailed down on certain issues. He has had problems with this stance on abortion, but other than that, you look up.
This week, Russia followed through on threats to take action against U.S.-funded outlets that are operating in the country. Russia labeling 9 media organizations as foreign agents. Now, it's a move seemingly in retaliation for the U.S. requiring the American version of the Russian news network RT to register with the Justice Department as a foreign agent. With me now is Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland, a member of the Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, you criticized this latest move, saying it's just an excuse to further curb the free press in Russia. Why should viewers care?
Well, Brian, we should understand that Mr. Putin uses the fake news and his press outlets as a tool. It's not an independent press. It is part of the strategy of Mr. Putin to interfere in other countries. They use it for propaganda. They use it for fake news. It's part of their tool chest, tool in their tool chest to bring about a different type of government in other countries. So it's something that should concern Americans, absolutely.
And you think there's a big difference between what Voice of America, which is a U.S.-funded outlet, does versus what Russia Today does? Isn't that the heart of this dispute?
No, absolutely. There's a difference here. We don't go over the edge and create news or use fake news or lies in order to bring about a change in government. What we try to do through Voice of America and from other news outlets is to get the information to the Russian audience so they understand the truth, what's going on. They can make their own judgment as to how they would like their country to proceed, but we want to make sure that they get independent news information rather than controlled information coming out from the Russian government.
So how's this going to end? There's been concern that maybe next Russia might try to kick out U.S.-based news outlets like CNN, not funded by the U.S. government, but based in the U.S. There's been concern about that. There's also been questions about whether Russia Today is going to be taken off cable here in the United States. How do you see this ending?
Well, make no mistake about it, Russia under Mr. Putin will continue to try to control the information, not just in their own country, but in countries where they believe they can influence, the former republics of the Soviet Union or countries that were under the domination of the Soviet Union. They are very much going to use whatever tools they can to influence public opinion, including who the citizens of that country vote for their leaders. We saw that in our election, but we also saw it in European elections. So we got to be realistic about this. We're not playing on a level playing field. Obviously, we're going to have to protect our own country from that type of fake information and fake news that comes through Russia.
Let me ask you also about net neutrality while I have you here. The Republican FCC chair, Ajit Pai, is moving forward with a vote this week to repeal the Obama-era net neutrality rules. Tell me why you and so many other Democrats have asked him not to do this, have asked him to delay the vote.
Well, access to the Internet is a public utility, and we have to make sure that it's not regulated in a discriminatory manner which denies small businesses or individuals to the same type of Internet service that others receive. So it is a matter of public interest, and we do believe the SEC is moving down the wrong path in trying to deny equal access to the Internet.
Shouldn't there be a congressional remedy here, meaning a new law passed in Congress in order to create 21st century regulations for how companies that provide Internet access should be regulated? Because right now these net neutrality rules, they're based on very outdated legislation.
Brian, you're absolutely right. I mean, Congress has a responsibility not just in access to the Internet and net neutrality, but in so many other areas Congress needs to act. So I have called upon the Republican leadership in Congress to allow us to debate these issues and to act on these issues, but we don't see any real willingness on behalf of the Republican leadership to schedule any congressional debate on these subjects.
Senator, thanks for being here today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And coming up next, David Axelrod on why it matters how much TV President Trump watches. You're going to want to hear this. We'll be right back.